We all want things to be fair, right? We want things to be affordable. So what if the government just passed a law to make it happen? It seems so simple. But you know, when governments step into the marketplace, the results are almost never what you'd expect. Today, we're diving into the hidden consequences of some very good intentions.
So let's start with the why. Why do governments even get involved in the first place? Well, it almost always starts with a real problem, something that affects millions of us, like, sky-high rent or a wage that just doesn't stretch far enough. The intention really is almost always to help people out.
Okay, let's take housing. Picture this. You're trying to find a place in New York City, and the average rent is hitting something like a staggering $3,500 a month. I mean, that is a massive chunk of anyone's paycheck. So it makes you wonder, couldn't we just pass a law saying rent can't be that high? And look, it's not just about where you live, it's about what you earn. We hear it all the time that pay for certain jobs is just way too low. So again, the question seems pretty straightforward. Can't we just mandate a fair wage? Let's pull back the curtain on these ideas and see what actually happens when we try. All right, so let's tackle that rent question first. When a government says to landlords, hey, you can't charge more than this amount, they're setting up what's called a price ceiling. Let's see how that one plays out.
So our first big term here is price ceiling, and it's exactly what it sounds like, a legal cap on how high a price can go. Now, here's the kicker. If you set that ceiling above what people are already paying, well, it doesn't do anything. It's irrelevant. But when you force that price below the natural market rate, well, that's when the dominoes really start to fall.
Okay, so let's put some numbers on this. Let's imagine the going rate, the market rate, for a decent apartment is $1,000 a month. The government, trying to help out, steps in and caps all rents at $800. I mean, that sounds fantastic for renters, doesn't it? Well, what happens next? Well, this is the immediate effect. At that lower capped rent, landlords, they're just not as motivated, so they're only willing to supply about 60,000 apartments. But at that great low price, 100,000 people want one. And just like that, you've created a massive housing shortage of 40,000 units.
And that shortage, it kicks off this whole chain reaction. First, finding an apartment becomes an absolute nightmare. People spend weeks, months even, just searching. Economists have a term for this, increased search activity. And then you get the black market. All of a sudden, you're not just paying rent. You're paying some shady broker key money or being forced to buy ridiculously overpriced, worthless furniture just to get your foot in the door.
And here is the real paradox of it all. The law made the rent cheaper, for sure, but it didn't necessarily make housing cheaper. When you actually add up the cost of your time, all that stress, any under-the-table fees, the total cost to finally land that cheaper apartment can actually be more than what the market was charging in the first place. Crazy, right? So a price ceiling pushes prices down. But what happens when the government does the exact opposite and forces a price up? Well, this brings us right to the heart of the minimum wage debate, which is all about something called a price floor. And this is what we call a price floor. The logic is basically the mirror image of a ceiling. It only has an effect if it's set above what the market would have paid on its own. And, the most famous, most debated price floor in the entire world is the minimum wage.
Okay, let's run through another simple scenario. Imagine the market rate, the equilibrium for low-skilled jobs, is $6 an hour. Then the government comes in and mandates a minimum wage of $7 an hour. And here's what happens. At that higher wage, companies, well, they only want to hire for about 20 million hours of work. But at the same time, you've got way more workers attracted by that higher pay, offering up 22 million hours of their time. That gap, that extra 2 million hours, that's a labor surplus. And we have another name for that, unemployment. So what you get is a really clear set of winners and losers. The folks who get to keep their jobs or get a new one at the higher wage, they get a really welcome pay raise. But think about who loses. It's the people who would have been perfectly happy to work for $6 an hour, but now they're completely shut out of the market. They become the face of that labor surplus we just saw. Okay, let's switch gears and dive into one of my favorite, most surprising topics in economics: taxes. When the government decides to put a tax on something, the question of who actually pays for it, well, it is rarely as simple as just reading the law. Let's use a real-world example here. New York City slaps a $1.50 tax on every single pack of cigarettes. And the law is crystal clear. The sellers are responsible for paying it. So you'd think, okay, easy. The tobacco companies pay the tax. But the market has other ideas. So how does this actually play out? Well, think of it this way. For the seller, that tax is just a new business cost.
So to stay profitable, they have to try and pass some of it on, which means the price you see on the shelf goes up. But at the same time, the seller doesn't get to keep that extra money. They have to send it to the government. So the price the buyer pays goes up, but the amount of money the seller actually keeps goes down. And that gap between those two numbers is what economists call the tax wedge.
So let's look at the buyer's side of that wedge. In this particular case, the price at the counter goes up by a full dollar. Now just remember, the law said the seller pays the tax. But in reality, you, the buyer, you end up footing the bill for $1 of that $1.50 tax. That's the market at work.
And what about the seller? Well, they're the ones who have to write that $1.50 check to the government. But since the price only went up by $1, they have to pull the other 50 cents straight out of their own pocket. That is their share of the burden, even though on paper, they were supposed to pay for the whole thing.
And this right here, this reveals a fundamental truth about economics. The law can say who has to mail the check, but the market has the final say on who truly bears the cost. This division of the burden, it's called tax incidence, is decided entirely by the forces of supply and demand.
So, what decides how that burden gets split? It all comes down to a concept called elasticity, which is really just a fancy way of saying flexibility. Basically, who has more options? If buyers are totally inflexible, like they have to buy a product, say insulin for a diabetic, they have no choice but to pay whatever the new price is. In that case, buyers pay 100% of the tax. But if buyers are super flexible, let's say they're buying a pink pen and could just as easily buy a blue one, they're not going to accept a price hike. So the seller has no one to pass the cost to, and they have to eat the entire tax themselves.
Okay, so we've seen how price controls can cause shortages and taxes can create these surprising burdens. But what happens when people just decide to, sidestep the rules altogether? This is where we find the market's hidden side, the underground economy.
Whenever doing business legally becomes too expensive or too complicated, you can bet that an illegal alternative will pop up to fill that void. This quote from a study on California's economy says it all, really. Employers will pay cash under the table to get around minimum wage laws and taxes. It's essentially a parallel market that exists for one simple reason: to bypass all the official rules.
And that brings us right back to where we started. The desire for things like fair wages and affordable housing, that's real and it's important. But what we've seen is that the market is kind of like a powerful river. You could try to build a dam or redirect it with laws, but that water will always find a new path, whether that path is a shortage, a black market, or a surprising tax burden. So the real challenge isn't just about having good intentions. It's about understanding the powerful currents we're dealing with before we try to change their course.